All right, we're spending one more show on this feed over the course of this week. I was going to say digging through the wreckage of the 2026 NFL draft. It's a pretty terrible connotation. Just kind of sorting through everything that went down last weekend. You know, for us, I mean, you're in the same boat. As you guys react to everything that happens in real time, there are things that you just are never going to get your arms around fully in the moment. And so kind of sitting with everything and looking at the draft classes and really parsing them with a little bit more time and space over the last couple days, I think inevitably some of your thoughts about what happened over the course of the weekend are going to change or they're going to shift. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you today, Fran, talking about a few of those moments, a few of those instances where since the draft has happened, as we've gotten a little bit more distance from it, what have we reconsidered or maybe what has come into focus that wasn't necessarily apparent as things were happening in real time this weekend?
Yeah, and I love the concept of the show. I think that at the end of the day, we are so reactive right away, and a lot of it has to do with the preconceived notions and expectations going into draft weekend. You know, Carnell Tate goes number 4, and it's like, whoa, like we did not really talk about this happening, and then it's like, all right, now I have to resit with it for a little bit. Maybe we'll talk about that soon. But I would say for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like we're going to continue to have an evolving conversation about the tight end position. And I think that that's not something that's going to be going away. And I'm probably going to be spending a lot of time thinking about it and watching the tight end position, not just like through the summer and the rest of the offseason, but as we get into the fall.
So that was one of mine. That was one of my 5 that I had. And my note about it was, I'm still sorting through what to make of this. Because I think that there are a couple different directions you could go with it. I had a conversation with an offensive coordinator at the Combine, and I told him when we were sitting there, I was like, I think Jackson Hawes is going to be the most influential player in the NFL from 2025. He's like, what does that mean? I was like, I just think that teams are going to try to find this guy. I think that we're just going to have this world as we kind of chase the hot thing schematically in the league, and teams are going to be like, how can we find a blocking tight end to put in there because of all of the myriad advantages that can create for you. And then we saw it happen. Like we legitimately saw it happen on day 2. And so you look at last year's tight ends. There were 4 tight ends drafted on day 2 last year. 3 of those guys were Elijah Arroyo, Terrence Ferguson, and Harold Fannin, which are just different sorts of tight ends that were drafted in day 2 this year. 143 catches in college for Ferguson. Fannin had like 143 catches his final year in college. And Arroyo was less productive, but he's a 235-pound player. So the day 2 tight ends that were drafted in 2025 are the sort of high-value pass catchers that I think the league had chased at that position over the last 5-7-ish years. And then you look at this year, there were 8 tight ends drafted on day 2 this year. And after Stowers, how many of them weigh less than 245 pounds? Almost to a man, and you know this more than me. Those 8 guys drafted, their biggest selling point is that they're big-bodied players that hopefully you can utilize in some of these looks. And so maybe some of this is available talent in the draft. Maybe some of this is an overreaction schematically, but I think maybe both of them converging at the same time to create this really crazy pivot when it comes to body types at the position that early in the draft.
This is something that I've been kind of sitting on for, I want to say like 18 months or so, because last year at this time, I had Jackson Hawes comfortably inside my top 100. He was just inside my top 90 going in. And the way I do my big board, and we'll talk about this in a little bit too, but the way I do my board is not necessarily how I see them getting drafted, like which order. I'm not trying to guess the top 100 picks. I'm trying to foresee, how valued will this player be 4 or 5 years from now? And so when I looked at Jackson Hawes, I'm like, this guy's got the ability to be a dominant blocker, like a numbers changer for you in the run game. And so this was coming off an offseason where, we saw this year, we saw Charlie Kolar get paid $8 million, Daniel Bellinger get paid $8 million a year, but we've kind of been living in this world already. Luke Farrell got paid just under $7 million last year. Josh Oliver was at $7 million the offseason before. Like that's real money. That's like starting linebacker money, starting running back money, starting DB, starting offensive lineman, guard, centers. So, guys like Will Dissly, Charlie Warner, Brock Wright, they're in that bucket just below them. And so I'm like, all right, like this is a position that the league is showing us. There's a handful of these guys, but the league is showing us that there is real value in this player. And so if I'm looking at Jackson Hawes, he was such an awesome run blocker. I think that he's going to be a guy that will be valued this way a few years from now. And then lo and behold, like as we get into this season in 2025, not only was he awesome, but then you just see the proliferation of the 12 and 13 personnel, and it became such a talking point, whether it was like the AJ Barner aspect of things in Seattle, but then obviously once Sean McVay gets involved with all the 13 personnel and what they were doing, now it's in vogue. Now everybody wants a piece of that. And so it's going to be an ongoing discussion. And obviously the draft has a big part of that as well.
And I think Sean is the most clearly chased offensive coach in the NFL when it comes to trends. Ben Johnson is closing in. When you talk to other coaches around the league and who they're watching, I think a lot of teams are interested in what Ben was doing in Chicago last year. And obviously, this is a team that loved to be in 12 personnel. They've overinvested in the tight end position yet again. My question with this is not why it's happening. I think it's obvious why it's happening. It's how much is this really going to matter? You're like, this reminds me a little bit of all of those teams chasing these pterodactyl corners in the early 2010s because everyone wanted to be like Seattle. And then you kind of realize that there's a special sauce that you can't just create by taking the same body types. And so even as we over-index to these sorts of tight ends, how many teams are actually going to have the right combination of players and the right plan to implement these sort of guys and make good on the investments that they're pouring into it? I think that remains to be seen. I think that's kind of where I don't know where I land on this. Like, I get why it's happening. Whether it was the right decision and the right pivot for a lot of these teams, I think we're yet to find that out.
And I think it's definitely pertinent to that specific archetype of tight end. Where my head goes is like, what does this mean for the pass first guys? So you mentioned Eli Stowers going to the Eagles. You know, Justin Jolie, he lands with Sean Payton. Sean Payton trades up to get him in like the 5th round. And I love that because Sean Payton has proven like, yeah, this is how I use this player. I feel really confident in that. But if you are going to try and live in a 12 and 13 personnel world and you have these pass first guys, you know, we just saw this with Buffalo with Dalton Kincaid. You know, I think of Noah Fant. I think of Mike Gesicki. I think of Evan Ingram. I have Kyle Pitts, Luke Musgrave, who got passed by a guy in his own draft class, and Tucker Kraft. So, you know, Gerald Everett, like these guys, it feels so often that they fail to reach that expectation from pre-draft or contract, whatever it is. And because it's hard, it's a tight needle to thread to get defenses to respect the fact that you're going to be in 12 personnel with this player, that they're not just going to treat it as 11. And that's what I worry about with Stowers. And I think the way I'm kind of like starting to wrap my head around it is, are you a pass first tight end or are you a pass only tight end? And I fear for a guy like Stowers that he's more of the latter. And to me, it's more in the bucket of some of those other guys already listed, as opposed to guys like Sam Laporta, who, you know, like wasn't the best blocker, but they found ways to be able to use it. You know, Colston Loveland, like, yeah, in Michigan, like you got to block. It's maybe not a strength of his, but, you know, he can work around it. Harold Fannin Jr., like all guys where it's like, yeah, check the box, as opposed to like defined weakness. And it's going to be really interesting to watch those guys kind of play this out in this new world.
It's very funny what we're looking for now, though, and the box you have to check and the bar that you have to clear. Because with those pass first guys, it was, can you survive, right? Can you die slowly? Are you a credible blocker? Here, because the archetype of player that we're chasing has changed, now you need to clear a much higher bar as a blocker. And so the idea in theory with all these pass first tight ends is, well, if we were in nickel, we'd be able to grind you down against the run. And if you were in base, our pass first tight end is better than the third linebacker you're putting on the field. That the promise of that, teams often fell short of it because, well, if they're going to be in nickel and you can't grind them down because he's not a good blocker, what advantage are you gaining? That's the Dalton Kincaid kind of quagmire that I think the Bills found themselves in. Well, now the promise of this idea is different. It's we're going with the blocking guy first. Well, you can maybe be a credible blocker to an extent in college, but are you a really good blocker? Now you have to be like an assertive blocker in order to make good on this sort of investment. And so like how high the bar is you have to clear in certain aspects of the position have dramatically shifted from how we were thinking about it 3 or 4 years ago. And so while all of this stuff sounds so good in theory, the question is going to become, are these big body guys that seemed like they were good blockers in college, can we actually get there with them in the NFL? And that's just not the question we were asking about the tight end position, and especially day 2 tight ends over the last like 5 to 7 years.
Yeah. And like, I can't wait to see what like Darnell Washington gets paid, right? And just see like, all right, what these guys that are these needle movers, you know, when Jackson Hawes is up, you know, those kind of things. Like, I'm excited for that. And then even too, like as you were talking, I was thinking about those past first guys in a previous world. We're talking like a decade ago in the NFL, where in RPOs were all the rave, and it's like, oh well, you know what? Like we can use the tight ends on a pop pass in the RPO world, and that's how they're effective. We can use them on these slide routes where they're maybe they're going to slice the defensive end, but actually they release out into the flat, and you're keeping defenses honest that way. As defenses have kind of caught on to that, you have to find other ways to be able to use those tight ends. So it's going to be a really interesting kind of back and forth with those different archetypes at the position.
It was interesting to me because Howie was pretty explicit about his reevaluation of body types at tight end when he was talking to the media earlier this spring.
Yeah.
And then he comes out in the draft and drafts Eli Stowers in the second round. So it's like, is Johnny Muntz the manifestation of that reevaluation? Is that like kind of where we ended it? And so the fact that he said that and then they drafted a pass catching tight end in the second round, I just found that funny.
Yeah, I mean, they've brought in so many guys, Albert Okwuegbunam and, Tyree Jackson. Like, they've had a handful of these guys, the converted quarterback turned tight end. And so Stowers being available late in the second round and them saying, yep, this is the guy we want to roll with, shouldn't have been as big of a surprise as it was. But here we are.
I wonder, the last thing I want to ask you about this, because this can tap into like your knowledge of the draft class overall. I wonder if these guys were maybe a little bit overdrafted. Like the run starts with Borkature, who is one of the more overdrafted players when you look at the consensus board. And that has been the conversation about Jacksonville for the last 72 hours, which we can talk about or not.
We're going to get into that. Yep.
And I wonder, is that happening in this draft specifically because teams are so down on what things look like after pick 100, where they're sitting there being like, all right, I could draft a developmental player that is a situational pass rusher for me, or he's a tradesy corner, or I could draft a player who I think has more clear utility in who I'm trying to be. And I wonder if that was part of the thought process, conscious or not, that kind of led to the run that we saw on these sorts of tight ends on day two.
I do think it was probably the perfect storm because the closer we got to the draft, it was a lot of discussion about, all right, well, even in the back end of the first round, as that first and second tier of player went off the board, you were going to start to see teams, hey, we're just going to keep this in the fairway. Keelan Rutledge, come on down, right? Like those kinds of selections. And so thinking about it, like those kinds of tight ends are very easily projectable. And so, yeah, like if you're Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles and it gets to be the third round and everybody thinks you still haven't added a pass rusher yet, you still haven't added a defensive lineman yet, what are you doing? And rather than reach for a player that maybe requires more development or isn't quite the best fit for Dennis Allen's scheme, it's like, hey, we lost Durham Smythe. If we want to play the way that we want to play offensively, we need this guy, Sam Roush, to come in and be our third tight end right now. And so that may seem sacrilege to what we've come to know for positional value, but I think it makes sense, honestly.
The Sam Roush thing I had no issues with whatsoever. The Xavier Thomas thing is a different conversation that we could potentially get to. All right, so we both had the tight end one. So why don't you give me your next one? What is the next thing that you've kind of been mulling over and may have reevaluated or kind of sat with in the last couple of days about this draft?
All right, so now that I've slept on it, I think I'm more accepting of the Cardinals taking Jeremiyah Love at number 3.
So I have Jadarian Price as one of mine. Right, so I can't get there with Jeremiah. All right, so give me your argument. Because I'm very curious about this.
Well, now this is actually interesting because I thought you and Bill Barnwell had a great conversation last week, last month?
Yeah, it was last week, which it seems like a year ago, but it was last week.
You're right. But I thought you guys had a great conversation, and so much. One of the most enlightening things I caught from that was the running back at the end of the first round being a less fruitful area to be able to pluck those guys. So I'm interested to hear your take with Price. But I think at the end of the day, look, the draft is about acquiring great players, right? And we know that this was an unusual draft in that there weren't those blue chip guys, especially at the premium positions at the top. And I do think that at the end of the day, too, this is where like the human element does come into play with this franchise in particular, this owner in particular, even though it was a different regime. Like everyone's talked about like, oh, Arvell Reese, well, they might not do it because of Isaiah Simmons, but it's not just Isaiah Simmons. Like Zaven Collins, Hassan Reddick, Deion Buchanan. Some of these guys hit. Like Budda Baker was kind of a hybrid guy as a second-round pick, but they've dabbled in these waters of like the positionless player a handful of times and really struggled to be able to nail down like what was the best fit for this player. And then on top of it, they've invested so much capital into that defense over the last couple of years and basically ignored offense all offseason last spring. So I get, you know what? We're going to just give this offense as much juice as we possibly can. And I don't even think it's a thing. I know that there's been some stuff out there about, like Monty Ossenfort doesn't understand positional value. one of the things I do, because I'm sick in the head when it comes to this stuff, is that like I study like GM tendencies and talk in terms of like what do they like to do, what's a typical archetype of the players they hunt up in the draft. No one drafts premium positions at a higher rate than Monty Ossenfort when you look at his time. I mean, it was the same when he was in Tennessee under John Robinson, but it's one of the highest rates over the course of the entire draft, and it climbs when you get into just day one and day two, and certainly in round one. And so, where has that gotten them, right? They've taken maybe lesser players in some of these spots at premium positions, and if you're sitting here and you're like, man, we have the number 3 pick in the draft. We can either trade down, and if we're not getting the offers that we want, like we're kind of out of luck there, or we stay and we take a lesser player with a lower grade at a premium position that might be a gamble, and it's something that this owner has watched us do time and time again, or do we just take Jeremiyah Love, right? And so I actually, as we've sat on it a bit, I think I feel okay with it. I think I'm all right with what that decision ultimately ended up being for Ossenfort.
Part of me, if we're sitting with the practical realities of the current situation with the franchise, I think that's how you more easily get there. Not only what you're talking about with the ownership, but I think what you're talking about with the front office, right? Like this is, I was talking to someone in an analytics department a couple weeks ago when I was prepping for that show you mentioned with Barnwell. And we were talking about kind of the siren song of taking a running back early when you are a general manager that might be inching toward the hot seat. Because Arvell Reese is still an idea. Especially as a pass rusher, he's still an idea. Running backs, and another person I talked to said Jeremiyah Love, according to all of our metrics, all of our modeling, has the best chance of being a productive player of any player in this entire draft. So the fact that he is quote unquote safer, even if you can never be all that safe, let's put the number at 65 to 70% rather than 55%. That's a significant difference. So if you're Monty Ossenfort, I think there's something about just survival. Right. I think that there's something about just kind of keeping things in the fairway in order to make sure at the end of this year, you can look at your top 5 pick and be like, this guy had 1,200 yards. It took 480 touches for him to get to those 1,200 yards, but he was still a productive player for us. And so I can understand that because part of the argument for me, and this is the most important argument for me, and I've gone back to this multiple times as we've talked about the position in the last month, the opportunity cost to me is the most important thing. But the opportunity cost is like over a multi-year period. It's if you take a Jeremiyah Love in the top 5 this year, then you can't find a pass rusher where in theory, if you took the pass rusher, you can find a running back in the second round of next year's draft. Well, there's a chance that Monty Ossenfort just doesn't give a shit about next year's draft or the draft coming after that. And so I understand how it happens. And I think too often I can sit back here in this chair and hem and haw about optimized decision making and nitpick when it's not optimized decision making. When in reality, these teams, for the most part, are never operating that way. Like the report from Schefter this week about the AJ Brown trade likely netting the Eagles a 2028 first-round pick. They are afforded the luxury of operating that way because Howie will leave that job when he wants to. That is not how 25 of the front offices in the NFL are allowed to work. And so, I mean, it's probably more than that, right? And so that's a generous number. And so I think that it's important to at least consider the human element when it comes to stuff like this. And so while I can firmly say it is not the optimized way of using your draft capital, I think it's easier to kind of soften on it when you understand the reasons that these things happen. But I'll also say that's why bad teams stay bad.
Yep. No, and that's the thing is that at the end of the day, do I think it was the best? No, like not the best possible outcome, but I kind of get it. And I think I am more okay with it right now than I was 72 hours ago for sure.
And that's exactly how I feel about the Jadarian Price thing to Seattle. And if you look back at historical data, you're absolutely correct. And the Seahawks are one of these teams. You know, they drafted Rashad Penny in this exact range, and he did not work out for them. Some of that is injury related, but the history of these late first-round picks at running back over the last 20 years, there are far, far fewer misses than there are hits. And there are guys who had maybe like 1 good season, 2 good seasons, D'Angelo Williams, people like that. But compare D'Angelo Williams' on-field impact to the premium positions that you're going to, I'm not picking out D'Angelo Williams, I'm just using it as an example. People are going to look at some of these and remember a couple of these fantasy relevant seasons that these running backs had and be like, oh, that guy was kind of a hit. It's like, no, over like 1 to 2 contracts, it does not compare with the other players that you can draft. But for Seattle specifically in this position, right? You're looking at their roster and you're looking at their needs and you're looking at the lack of picks that they have. No running back went off the board after Jadarian Price until 90. And that was Kalen Black, who people thought was overdrafted.
It was a non-combine invite.
So there you go. A guy who
The
wasn't
worst running
invited to
back
the
class
combine
ever.
was the next running back taken at 90, and people thought it was one of the biggest reaches of the draft. For the most part, we got all these guys out of the top 100, okay? And so you're Seattle. And I do think that sometimes you can ascribe like a certain magic to the teams that are winning, that it sounds great in the short term, and then when you actually play it out over the long term, it becomes less great. But when we've seen what Mike Macdonald has done with back seven players in Seattle specifically, and the idea that, all right, we're going to find safety depth in round 2, corner depth in round 3. I trust this defensive infrastructure to make those guys work. And because you have Mike Macdonald on that defensive staff, I think the place where I landed was running back and pop at running back actually the scarcest skill set that Seattle could seek out in this draft? And if we're talking about scarcity as a reason to not take the running back in the first round, for them specifically, is there actually a scarcity argument for why it's justifiable for them to do this? And I think I land in maybe. I don't think I could firmly say it, but I think I land on maybe.
Yeah, and it was interesting because and I actually was thinking back to last year's draft about this as well, because John Schneider's former partner in crime in Seattle, the same thing happened with Pete Carroll and the Raiders last year, where everybody was all like the sharp analysts and mock draft. It was Ashton Genty going to the Raiders, and it was like, oh, this is a classic smokescreen from Pete Carroll. Like, they're not doing this. And I felt the same way about this one with Jadarian Price going to Seattle. I'm like, no, like they're not going to do it. I know he's going to trade down. Like and then he ends up taking it. And he said at the post-draft press conference, John Schneider, he says, yeah, like it was our love for him was out there, so out in the open, that we were afraid that someone was going to trade up ahead of us to take him, which would have been something. But I guess at the end of the day, it's one of those things where the need kind of supersedes everything else as well. I like you pointed out, and the scarcity on the market was absolutely the case in this class. I mean, it was easily the worst running back group I've ever personally evaluated. It was a bad group.
I think there are a couple other things to consider here. The first is, if you're going to have this level of urgency to find this position in the draft, why not see if you can get in the mix and re-sign Kenneth Walker? Like, you have the money to do it. And so I'm wondering what the thought process was there. There's a couple things that come to mind. You look at it, Kenneth Walker has a $19 million cap hit next year for the Chiefs. That's not nothing, right? Like, that's still a decent chunk of change. And even though Seattle has right now, I think it's like $55 million in cap space, and they don't really have any other extension candidates that aren't already on the books for 2027. Like, Devin Witherspoon's going to get paid, but he has a $21 million cap hit in 2027. And so I think that you could argue they have the financial flexibility to have given out that contract if they wanted to. But the other part of this is they're probably going to sign Witherspoon to that deal sometime this offseason. They're already 9th in cash spending this year. And after they give him that deal, they're going to be up near the top of the league. So there's a chance. And again, this is just like trying to read the tea leaves and understand why they wouldn't have wanted to be in the mix for a guy like Walker, knowing that they'd have this level of urgency. Maybe they just said, we've spent what we're going to spend this year. And maybe there's just a hard line with, we're not going to give a running back that sort of second contract. He had a great playoff run, but if you look at the last 4 years, he's been banged up a decent amount. Like, even if it is a hole on our roster, we just don't think the ROI is going to be there for us. So whatever the reason happened to be, I kind of get landing in this place.
Yeah, and I guess too the other part of it is, and I've heard Howie Roseman say this time and time again over the years, of like, the team building calendar does not stop after the draft, right? They've done that time and time again. But before this point, like, it was just Emmanuel Wilson that they added. It was a nice like change of pace option in Green Bay. But if Charbonnet can't go, and let's say a team traded up ahead of you and sniped you on Jadarian Price, like, what was going to be the answer? I guess it might have been one of these guys that are still out there on the open market. Maybe you swing a trade for a veteran, but at the end of the day, they were playing with fire a little bit. They didn't have a ton of draft capital to be able to move with. So, it worked out in their favor if they really felt like Price was the guy they had to come away with.
So part of the reason I've softened on this a little bit is because, again, I thought that corner depth and defensive back we had kept kind of mocking players, the Colton Hoods of the world, to them at 32. And if they found players at those positions a little bit later, does that make the price thing easier to stomach? Something that Dave brought up yesterday that I wanted to ask you about, the edge argument is a good one, because their edge depth now with Boye Mafe not there anymore, and DeMarcus Lawrence was healthy last year, he's getting a little bit older. Is there an argument that that's the direction that they should have gone there. And by bypassing that, that's the mistake they made in how they allocated the draft capital in that moment. I would be willing to hear that argument. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, there were a couple of players that were kind of like, oh, this is their kind of guy that could make some sense there. Gabe Akis is certainly one that popped into my mind right away. It's like, okay, he ended up being a second round pick. And he kind of fits that model. I think at the end of the day, like, I'm looking at the rest of these guys that went off the board right away in terms of edge rush. No, I mean, yeah, so R. Mason Thomas, Cassius Howell, like, I'm not sure if Howell was quite their cup of tea, but I think R. Mason Thomas, I think, could have been someone. Derek Moore, with the way that he wins. Zion Young, probably he's a different kind of player. So yeah, I mean, that's where the run kind of happened. TJ Parker went 3 picks into the second round. That's where the glut of those guys ended up going, was in that first 15 picks of the second round. I guess that's the gamble they took, and they didn't really get a chance to put a heavy asset into that after the draft, or after that pick.
Your point about team building not stopping when the draft ends, though, if you look at the available running back free agents and you look at the available edge free agents, I think you can make a solid argument that there are more rotational edge pieces on the market still than there are running backs that give you a little bit of giddy up that they needed. And so that also might be playing into the thought process. It's like, oh, we can go get Derek Barnett for $4 million. He can eat up 15 snaps a game for us. There is no one on the free agent market that's going to give us what Jadarian Price does in the best case scenario. Maybe that's part of the thought process.
Mercenary pass rusher is one of the best archetypes that you could find right now on the free agent market, and at running back,
my team sure hopes so.
Reliable. Yeah, well, yeah, they are far less reliable at running back in that market.
All right, so you went Love, I went Price. What's your next one here?
All right, so now that we've slept on it, I think a couple of the teams that did not have a first round pick still kind of crushed it in the draft. I like what a couple of these teams did that did not have, and because so much focus has gone on a number of teams that had a bunch of picks. But I look at what the Colts did, and I will give Chris Ballard, the GM of the Colts, a lot of credit here, because C.J. Allen is not their typical archetype of player. They are usually like hyper athletes, the guys that are kind of off the radar a little bit. C.J. Allen was falling down the board, and he's like, yeah, like he's going to be the green dot for us right away. He makes a lot of sense in Lou Anarumo's defense from that standpoint. But I look at it, all of my intel in talking with people there was like, yeah, keep an eye on edge rush. Even like the night before, like as night one came to an end, it was like, yeah, like edge rush tomorrow. And the fact that it's like, all right, no, like CJ Allen fell down the board to us, and we couldn't say no to that. I love that. AJ Halsey, I think he could start right away. And honestly, the body type is pretty similar to Nick Cross, and I liked his film more than I liked Nick Cross, when he was coming out of Maryland a few years ago. Jalen Farmer in the 4th round. Like, those are 3 guys that, to me, off my evaluation, I think could potentially start for this team within the next couple of years. So I kind of like what the Colts did. And then I look at Buffalo, and it's not sexy. They trade down a bunch of times. It's a bunch of just like solid players. TJ Parker, Davison Igbinosun, the corner from Ohio State, has been volatile over his career, but I thought the film this year was better than last year. Jude Bowery's got some potential. The tackle from Boston College, Jalen Kilgore, I think is a good scheme fit. Zane Durant, the undersized 3 technique from Penn State. A bunch of guys with high floor to be useful, and then like the upside to maybe turn into something down the line. The only caveat is, you've talked about this a lot, this team just like can you get a star there? Like, do they have the needle mover there? Is that going to come from this group? But at the end of the day, when you don't have the first round pick, and they were missing a second, Buffalo, that's why they traded down and got all that extra capital. I still like what they did, and I would say the same about Sean Payton in Denver. I really like what they didn't pick until the 3rd round, but I thought that they plugged a lot of holes and got guys that fit. I thought they got good value.
I'm with you on the Colts 100%. Like, if you look at what they did, I think they executed their plan perfectly. To get an extra 4th to move down and get CJ Allen there, because they traded with the Steelers who went out for Jeremy Bernard there. They used that extra 4th round pick to draft Betcher and get another linebacker because they needed more linebacker depth. And so the way they played the board, and pass rush for them is another one where I think they could be in the veteran market trying to find one more body. There's a reason that they were chasing after Trey Hendrickson and didn't end up getting him. So that's the one thing with the Colts, but they had enough holes on defense where even if they had found a pass rusher there, you're going to be sitting there saying, who the is going to play linebacker for the Colts this year? So I feel pretty good about how they handled it. It's funny that you feel that way about Buffalo, because one of mine, when it happened in real time, it was kind of like, I like TJ Parker. Like, TJ Parker's a good player. And then Igbinosun, I don't understand exactly how it fits, but like you get some of that, like the high end traits. Like, if it works out, he seems like he's going to be a good player. And so in real time, I was kind of like, okay, the Bills had like a solid draft. And then I sat with it for a little bit, and I found myself more and more disappointed by what it looked like. And I think it was for a couple different reasons. One, I was wondering whether the new staff would lead to them chasing a different sort of player in this draft, specifically at a player like edge rusher, right? So they, over the last 5 years, as you look at the guys they've drafted in the McDermott era, it's a lot of these like high floor, big bodied players. Like that's how many of them have come through that team. Boogie Basham, AJ Epinesa is that sort of player. Like Rousseau has a little bit more juice than that, but they've chased these sorts of guys. And so I'm thinking about what Denver felt like over the last couple years and the types of bodies and skill sets that they had been willing to embrace on the edge. And I'm like, all right, are they going to be a Malachi Lawrence team now in a way that they wouldn't have been over the last 2 or 3 years? And instead they trade down and draft TJ Parker. And it's kind of like, okay, this is more of the same. And I think that's my frustration with where it landed is this feels like more of the same. And I think that's probably okay because Brandon Beane has not done like an important job in the way that some people make it out to be. But I look at the front seven specifically, and even the whole defense. You can extend this even to safety. And I really hoped that they would just seek out more juice across the defense this offseason. And that didn't happen. It was really just Bradley Chubb. So Bradley Chubb has to carry that mantle as like the guy who's going to make this thing feel different outside of whatever scheme changes happen. And I just don't know if I love that being the place that we landed with this team on that side of the ball.
It's funny because one of my comps, well, actually, I think it might have been the first comp I had for TJ Parker was Bradley Chubb. So it makes total sense that that's the team he ended up with. But to me too, like as I looked at it, Buffalo they turned over so much of the roster, especially on defense with a lot. All right, like a lot of the Sean McDermott guys are out. We're moving on, especially in the back seven. So to like trade down and we're just going to accumulate bodies and try and like build up a new look and a new feel. I get like the vibes aren't necessarily different. The style isn't necessarily different, but I always find it interesting, especially given the fact that you've got I shouldn't say two new coordinators because Joe Brady's been there, but when you've got Joe Brady taking over and maintaining on offense and you bring in Jim Leonard, both guys have been in college in recent years. So like, was there going to be any kind of through lines to some of the guys that they added in or some of the, like new wrinkles from that way? And we didn't necessarily see that, but I'm cautiously optimistic here. I think they found a couple of nice like glue guys defensively. We'll see if it's able to manifest itself with how it looks in the next 2-3 years.
I think you're probably right in that like the responsibility involved with some of the picks was probably the right way to handle it. I just wanted to be a little bit more excited about it. And I think one of my only quibbles is I'm just curious about the Igbonason thing because I wonder like why cornerback depth in that spot was more important than trying. Like Kieron Crawford went 6 picks after Igbonason did. And I just think that if they had done that instead, how would I feel about what the Bills' defensive roster looks like right now? I think I would feel better about it. Maybe I shouldn't, right? Like maybe that was the right pick, but I just didn't expect that to be where they went with a second-round pick in this draft, given what they've invested at the position. And so I think I'm still sort of wrestling with like how I'm supposed to feel about this overall.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see, like, I know they brought in D. Alford, but, like, if you got Benford, you got Hairston, who you just spent a first on last year, to add in Igbonason into that group, who's playing inside of those 3 guys are on the field at the same time. That will be very interesting. But, yeah, it's Buffalo will continue to be at the forefront of things. Obviously, they added DJ Moore, and they didn't do too much. Also, they brought in Trent Sherfield in terms of the pass game. So, you're putting all your eggs in the DJ Moore basket to see if he's able to solve a lot of the issues that Josh Allen faced last year.
I think it's just a team I wanted to be more excited about than I am. I think that's where I land with it, even if, again, it's some of the picks they made might have been the prudent way to go with some of those moves. All right, so I had the Bills were one of mine. That was my, like, now that I've slept on it, how do I feel about the Bills? So what's your next one?
All right, now that we've slept on it, I think you're going to like this one. I'm probably too intrigued to watch the 4 defenses in the NFC East this year. And when I think about it, it's you have Vic Fangio and the Eagles, right? And hopefully it's a healthy Jalen Carter. You swap out Jalen Phillips for Jonathan Grenard. You mix in a healthy Nolan Smith. You've got Zach Bond, Jahad Campbell elevates back into the starting lineup with Nakobe Dean out the door. You bring in Reek Woolen to replace Adoree Jackson. They still got some things to figure out at safety, but feel good about that defense. I'm really excited there. Then you have 3 new defensive coordinators and teams that added like pivotal pieces to those units. So you look at the Giants, they bring in Denard Wilson, previously with the Titans, before that the Ravens and the Eagles. Denard's awesome. I'm really excited to see what he does with this defense. Obviously, you got Abdul Carter and Brian Burns. You bring in Arvell Reese, you put him next to Trey Edmonds. I'm trying to think of like, because they've already said he's going to play linebacker, Arvell Reese. Who is like the analog with John Harbaugh, like in terms of like a guy that was used as a true, like, all right, he's going to play off ball, then he's going to come down. The only one I could like really feel good about was like Malik Harrison. And I'm trying to, I don't know, like who else would be that guy? Like Bart Scott maybe early on, but even still, like I wasn't quite that. I couldn't quite figure out a guy that I felt good about with that comparison in that scheme. So it might be that they're going to do some different things than what they've done in the past. But the cornerback group, like you have Paulson Adebo, Greg Newsome, Drew Phillips. They draft Colton Hood in the second round. Deontay Banks, we'll see if he makes the roster. But you're 5 deep at corner there. Javon Holland, Tyler Nubin, Ardarius Washington, Jason Pinnock is the safety group. We know that they like to play in sub in that defense. Like I don't know. I'm kind of intrigued to see what that group looks like for the Giants. Dallas, Christian Parker, like, both, I think you and I are on the same page there, in terms of who they're handing the reins over to. But you get Caleb Downs as kind of like your fulcrum piece. You bring in Jalen Thompson. You have Malik Hooker still. That cornerback group where you have Deron Bland, hopefully healthy. Kobe Durant, you come over from the Rams, and then you have 2 young guys in Siobhan Ravel and Devin Moore who have like legit tools to be at like starting caliber outside corners as long as they can stay healthy. Overshown's healthy now. You bring in D. Winters. You draft Jayshawn Barham from Michigan. You got the new look edge rush group, including the first round pick Malachi Lawrence. You have Quinnen Williams, Kenny Clark inside. Like that's kind of a fun, feisty defense that if they go from just being like one of the worst to like average, I think Christian Parker gets them there. This is a more feistier team. And then Washington, like Durante Jones, one of the quietest defensive coordinator hires in the league right now, comes over from the Brian Flores tree. And so everything we come to expect from that, I'm surprised that coaching staff has not been poached over more often. So he comes over. Sonny Styles, drop him right in the middle. I think it's a really, really good schematic fit. Leo Chenal is kind of like your Andrew Van Ginkel, and you have Frankie Louvu there to kind of do some of those similar kinds of things. You have the rush group of Odafe Owe, Caleb Chason, and Dorrance Armstrong with Deron Payne and Charles Omenihu up front with Dietrich Wise and Javon Kinlaw, Tim Settle. Like I like the depth up front. They still have some work to do on the back end, but I don't know, man. Like all 4 of these units, I'm kind of excited about.
I totally agree. Like I'm at least interested in watching it. And the Sonny Styles thing, I don't know. I'm curious how you felt about the Sonny Styles thing. That was one where even in real time, I was like, this needed to happen. If this didn't happen, they are in a bad way at that position specifically because all they had was Chenal and Louvu. And so you have these guys that are best moving forward. Those are your 2 linebackers. Like one of the biggest issues with that team last year is that they had no range at linebacker, like 0. Bobby Wagner just cannot move that way at this point in his career. And so finding a guy with the juice that Styles has, like it almost felt like necessary for them to leave the top 10 with Sonny Styles, even if they're, if Carnell Tate had fallen to them, et cetera, or whatever. So I'm with you on that. I'm excited to watch what that front 7 feels like. Let's not talk about the back end. The other teams with the Giants, Malik Harrison's a good shout, but like even Malik Harrison was more used in that role in the line of scrimmage and like run first situations. So I don't know if there is like a proper analog. Like obviously, Patrick Queen was a heavily used blitzer. And so they're willing to have a guy that, again, your best trait as an off-ball linebacker in pass-first situations is moving forward. And so I think that that's maybe something we think about with Arvell Reese. But I also just think that he's going to be everywhere. Like when it's 3rd and 8, and we said this in the moment when he got drafted, it's like, imagine that team on 3rd and 8. Like if he's going to be used as an on the line of scrimmage player in those situations.
That's very fun in those instances. I'm very excited. Yes.
And I think that they will have a plan for him, and I think they will have a good plan for him. And so him playing off the ball on early downs and then being used as sort of a move around the formation pass rushing piece everywhere, like in those moments, I'm very excited to see what that happens because I'm with you. I think that Denard Wilson, in Tennessee, like the cornerback room in that building over the last couple of years, combined with the lack of edge rush talent, like it's just hard to get by that way. I'm very excited to see him, like you said, a team that goes 4 deep at corner and now has all of these pass rush bodies. I think that we're going to be talking about Denard Wilson much differently at the end of this year than we are right now as like a football collective. And in Dallas, it's like, yes, like I've been wanting to see this. And
Yep.
so the Cowboys is actually where I wanted to take this.
Okay.
Now that I've sat with this, now that I've slept on it and just been thinking about the Cowboys over the last couple days, I don't think they could have positioned themselves any better in the last 12 months than they have based on where they were. Like if you told me 18 months ago that the Cowboys are going to hire Brian Schottenheimer as their head coach and they are going to trade Micah Parsons, what they now have, where they now are on the opposite on the other side of both of those things, I could not feel better about what the Dallas Cowboys are on the other side of those two choices than I do right now. I
Yeah,
really don't think I could.
I think that's totally fair. I think the only thing that has me a little bit worried is the George Pickens thing is still kind of like in the
Yes.
orbit, right? And it's like, all right, like that feels like it just needs like one spark to completely blow up. And then to me, the other big one, and this has been really big with this team, is can everybody stay healthy? Like Bland has faced injury issues, Overshown has faced injury issues. I mentioned those two corners, making sure that those young guys can stay healthy. Like if they're able to stay healthy, you feel really good about it. But if not, like that's where the house of cards can come falling down.
It's not perfect by any stretch. They're
Yes.
still thin on the interior, the defensive line. They,
Yep.
I think, for all of this to come together, kind of need Malachi Lawrence to pop in year one. Like if you look at the rest of that room, like they need to thread some needles. They need stuff to come together. And the other one I had was this feels like a 1-year shot with Pickens, right? Like your offense as constructed, this is probably the last year you have with this. But I think on so many different fronts, like they've been creative in ways they weren't before this. They've been situationally aggressive in how they've built the team in ways they weren't before this. I think that the choices they made and how they've assembled the staff, there were mistakes, right? Like I think we've seen this a few times recently where we have the first time head coach hire the former head coach as his defensive coordinator is kind of like a high floor move and then realize pretty quickly that the floor is lower than you want it to be. But I think by going out and doing what they did with Christian Parker, they've corrected in the right way. And now I think that the defensive staff and the choices there mirror the choices they made with the offensive staff. Because part of my concern with Brian Schottenheimer as a head coaching hire is that when has Brian Schottenheimer been like a sought after play caller that is going to be one of those difference makers in that role when you elevate him to being a head coach? But even the moment when they hired Clayton Adams and then when they went and get Connor Riley as their offensive line coach, like I think they did such a good job of building out the rest of that offensive staff in order to kind of supplement what he was bringing to the table. And then you saw the results from them last year. And now I feel like that level of kind of ingenuity and finding the right minds in the right places has extended to the defense. And then you add in what they did in the draft, and it just, again, I just feel as good about them as I possibly could after some of those seismic decisions that they made that I think there was a lot of consternation about. And we can still argue about whether trading Micah Parsons was the right move, but I think the ways they've used those resources in the aggregate, they've done it about as well as you could have hoped.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, where I land with that group is just we feel really good about Dak Prescott when he's healthy. We feel really good that offensive line, like that run game, Clayton Adams, they secured Javonte Williams, like, all right, like all systems go. It's just and look, this is the case with every team, right? Like if Patrick Mahomes goes down, like, all right, then, things have unfolded.
I think there are more realistic concerns with this team though than there are with some other teams, right?
I didn't even mention Javonte Williams. Like he was healthy last year, but that was a big issue for him in Denver. Like you go like literally through the offensive line, like that's been an issue. So that's honestly like my only hang up. Otherwise, there's no reason why that team shouldn't be in contention to represent the NFC when it comes to the next Super Bowl.
And I think that's where I land with it. Yeah. Are there reasons to think that this is more fragile than you want it to be, especially over a multi-year period? 100%. But I think all I really wanted from this team with this quarterback and some of the other talent that they had is your best good enough to win the Super Bowl? If it all comes together for you, are you good enough to get there? And I think with the Cowboys right now, the answer is yes. Like, I really do think it is. And I just don't think I would have believed that if you were to rewind a year and a half into the past. And so I'm just surprised to have landed in this place with them. And I think getting a guy like Caleb Downs and having that be potentially the skeleton key that allows the Christian Parker thing to come together in a way similar to what happened with the Philly defense in that draft class they had 2 years ago. I don't know. I just feel like the heights that this team can get to are pretty damn high, and I think you'd feel pretty good about threading that needle based on where you were if you were a Cowboys fan.
If you were watching that defense, a year ago, to think that we'd be sitting here on, in late April and saying, you know what, like there is a non-zero chance that this defense ranks higher in like EPA per drive than the offense does next year. Like that's not that's not non-zero in my opinion.
I think you better hope that's not the case, though.
Yeah, well,
I think the offense has to be like the second best offense in the league for that to come together in the way that we're talking about.
Let's say they have a slight drop off, they get down to 11, and then you say that the Cowboys or the defense is as a top 10 defense. Like it's not completely out of the question.
No, it's not. But I think for them to be the team we're talking
they
about,
need the offense
they need Guyton to stay healthy. They need like it all to come together, and they need to be a like, oh man, like the Cowboys are coming to town sort of offense. And I think that has to happen for them to make good on what we're talking about here. All right, so now that you've slept on it, what's one more thought that you have about this draft?
All right, well, now that we've slept on it, I think our focus, and I mean this collectively, on consensus boards may have gone like a little too far.
I was hoping you were going to bring this up, so I didn't have to.
All right, yep. And I say this like I think that consensus boards are awesome. Like the one that I go to Arif all the time. Arif Hassan does an outstanding job with it. Like, and it's absolutely a useful tool, especially for us on the outside. But a few things, especially when it comes to like the NFL teams and like their usage of the consensus boards. Not every big board is created equal, right? Like so, what Dane sees, what Daniel Jeremiyah sees is different than the 118th big board might see, right? Not every big board serves the same purpose. I referenced it earlier. Like the way that I do my board and like my top 100 is more about like looking into the future, what I think guys are going to be. I know for a fact, and guys are very public about this, when I put out my top 100, I'm trying to predict the top 100 players that go off the board. I don't care about that. That's what mock drafts are for. So that's what, when I do mine, that's not the way I go about it. So to just go strictly off those rankings, that kind of muddies up the data a little bit. The other thing is like teams don't have 300 players on the board. The teams have like 140 on the board, 175 maybe. Like I know some teams like below 100. So it's like you don't have this huge board. It's for a number of different reasons. Teams have all their specific guidelines and preferences. Akeem Mesidor went 22 overall. He goes to the Chargers. He would have never gone 24 overall to the Cleveland Browns. Andrew Berry is not selecting a 25-year-old pass rusher in the first round. That's not going to happen. Some teams completely avoid character and medical red flags. Other teams actively seek them out because they see it as a value play. Some teams have extremely strict body types on like athletic testing thresholds. You and Dave, I listened. I wanted to make sure I got all of my like thoughts in order for this show before I listened to yesterday's. So I listened to it just before this. And you and Dave talked about the Panthers on yesterday's show and like the through line on size and watching those guys come through, as these names come through. Man, this is a big draft class. That's been the case over the course of the Dan Morgan era. There is that they don't take small guys. Since Dan Morgan has been the general manager, they don't select small players, and so everybody's
the Panthers don't select small players, huh?
Exactly right. At least in the last three drafts now. So at the end of the day, yeah, like everybody, and that's not even taking into account like team needs and things of that nature. So these boards are really, really small, and I know like. You point to Nate Borkature going in the, where he went in the draft. I know that there were some teams that were picking right behind Jacksonville that Borkature was ready to go. And so at the end of the day, if you feel convicted, this is our guy. Like I love Keldrick Falk, right? Love Keldrick Falk. I had him very, very high. Would I have taken him that high? No. I would have tried if I let's say I was picking ninth. I would have tried to try and move down. I would, do whatever I got to do. If that's the guy I want, that's the guy I want. I bite the bullet a little bit. But at the end of the day, like the teams are working within some very specific guidelines. I think that we can go a little overboard on criticizing a team like San Francisco or Jacksonville. Now, you don't want to live in that world. You don't want to consistently draft guys like outside of what that consensus is. But at the end of the day, like I think you got to stay true to your convictions.
2 questions. One, do you think this draft led to more of these moments
Great
than a
point.
typical draft would? Because it
Yes.
feels like two things are happening at the same time. The analytics community, which offers a ton of value, of which I am let's call me an enthusiast, if not an active participant. I don't know enough to be an active participant. I appreciate the work that a lot of those people do, and I abide by many of the
You and me
principles that
both. Yeah,
they
agreed.
land on, right?
Yes.
I think they have gained a voice when it comes to football media, and like it is a louder voice than it probably would have been 10 years ago on the internet. That coming at the same time that this draft class comes along feels like we're pulling at this thing from two different directions and it's snapped in the middle.
Right. Yeah. I think that it's a great point, and this was a class. Everybody saw players a lot differently, and now that the draft is over, we're hearing like analysts, reporters, like insiders all leak out. Oh, like this team had Deshaun Stribling over Malachi Lemon. This team had this guy over that guy, but that's how it is in every draft. When you talk to coaches, like you get this, is that people I think would be taken aback by how often a coach, a GM, a high ranking executive might see your favorite, these three players in a stack and say like, oh, this guy's not even close. And he might go ahead of that player once we get into draft day. And that's the part of it too, is that each team, you have all these evaluators under one roof. They don't all see these players the same thing. It's the same way. And so the consensus for when John Lynch says the only consensus we care about is like our consensus, I get what he's saying, and I also get why the reaction to it has been the way it is. But I think that the wholesale, oh, if you're not going off the consensus board, you're doing it wrong sentiment, I think that's probably a bridge too far.
The other question that I had for you in that vein, is there a point in the draft where you think it becomes even less important to abide by the wisdom of the crowd's value that the consensus board provides?
I think that's a good question. I honestly think that it's probably most important, and it's because it's the easiest. Easiest is probably not the right word, but when you're picking early, more people are talking about more of these players, right? So you can get more
Yes.
intel. You have a more understanding of, hey, like the Pittsburgh Steelers. If Mekhi Lemon falls to the Steelers at 20, they are going to take Mekhi Lemon, even though everyone thinks they're going to take a tackle, right? If everyone knows, like, oh, Caden Proctor, he's probably not falling past Detroit. So if you want Proctor, you got to get ahead of him, or you got to take him earlier than that. When you get to the sixth round, when you get to the third round, you get to the fourth round, that type of intel becomes a little bit harder. And, so much of it, you're dependent on your pro scouts, your pro scouting staff, who have a deep understanding of all the teams that are inside their area. So every scout, responsible for 4 teams, 6 teams, 8 teams, whatever, depending on the franchise. They are the ones that are going to be the experts on those teams that they are responsible for. And they say like, hey, these are their needs. This is what, and then that's when they plug all of that stuff into their own models to try and project forward. Hey, this is where we think a guy's going to come off the board. To be so stubborn about it and say like, oh, we're not going to pay attention to any of it, that's wrong. That's an extreme. But I think that if you're Jacksonville, you're the Rams. I know the Rams are like getting crushed. They traded 3 picks to go up and get CJ Daniels, a 6th-year wide receiver from Miami. Like, he's a good player. He's had a history of foot injuries that have lingered for like 3 years. But like, I get it. But to me, like, I find it hard to argue with that, knowing like the work that I guess goes into it and through the entire process and how it's going to look different for all 32.
All right, so I have like 1.5 more. The one
Okay.
I absolutely wanted to mention, now that I've slept on it, is the Browns' biggest problem over the last 5 years simply about volume?
Which comes down to one thing, one decision.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's is that if
Yep.
we move, and I was going to say, if we move past that decision,
Aside from that,
aside from the franchise crippling choice that this
right.
regime made, you look at the Browns during the Andrew Berry era. I think this is right, and I you can double check my math after we're done, but I think this is right. In the Andrew Berry era, so since 2020, okay, the Browns have had 7 top 75 picks before the last 2 years. From 2020 to 2024, they had 7 picks in the top 75. Jed Wills, Grant Delpit, Greg Newsome, JOK, Martin Emerson, Cedric Tillman, Michael Hall. It's not great, but it's not horrendous. that hit rate in the top 75. And then when you look at picks outside of the top 75 overall, I'm sure you have historical hit rate data on that. What is it? 20%
It's
outside of the top 75 for a guy to
yep,
turn into a starting caliber player?
something like that. Yeah,
So
I'm like looking at the
the
list right
idea
now.
that like we we think about David Bell and Anthony Schwartz and all these guys. It's like, let's look at other we only talk about that because they were like the first picks that they made in those drafts. I
Right.
think we'd be less fixated on them if we had first and second round picks to talk about. So they had 7 top 75 picks over the last 5 drafts. Do you know how many top 75 picks they've had in the last 2 drafts combined?
Probably the same amount.
8
Yeah, there you go.
more.
Yep.
They've
Yep,
had
more.
one more in the past 2 drafts than they had over the previous 5 combined. Those top 75 picks over the last 2 drafts, Mason Graham, Carson Schlesinger, Quidsaw Junkins, Harold Fannin, Spencer Fano, Casey Concepcion, Denzel Boston, Emmanuel McNeil Warren. You feel pretty good about that.
Yep.
And so is it the case that the Browns' actual problem is not that Andrew Berry doesn't know what he's doing, it's the fact that he had no picks to work with for the first 5 years of his tenure?
And
Now that I've
and
slept on it, I think that might be the case.
I I wholeheartally agree with you, and that's why he's still there. To be honest, like I think that, look, it's unfortunate how things kind of ended with he and Stefanski, and how like a move it was felt like had to be made there. But Andrew Berry being the general manager of the Cleveland Browns, like that to me is a well deserved role. Like I tell you, he has not done an abhorrent job, especially if you kind of remove that decision. You say like, hey, if that wasn't him, then you look at the rest of the body of work, and I don't think that it's been terrible.
Yeah, I said this in the moment when they kept him, and I said it in the moment when they kept him and Stefanski 2 years ago. Can you make an argument that this, even as we transition from one era to the other, these are the right people to be in these roles? NFL teams often don't do that, right? Like there's a stink on the previous regime to the point where you're just like, yeah, it's just easier to clean house and start over, even if we think this guy is as good or better as whoever his replacement's going to be. NFL teams do that a lot. They chose not to do that with the GM. And so maybe this is colored by the fact that I think Spencer Fano and Casey Concepcion are my 2 favorite players in the draft. But you look at what they got in that haul last year and the potential of this sort of class and kind of how it fell. I don't know, man. It seems like the Browns have done an okay job of like digging themselves out of the grave over the last 2 drafts. And I think a huge part of that is the fact that it helps when you have picks.
I agree. Can I throw one more at you?
You sure can.
And it's kind of riding off of you and Dave talked about it yesterday, so that's why I bumped it down my list because I was going to bring it up. Now that I've slept on it, I think I might want to buy some stock in the Titans. I think I'm kind of buying what they're selling, and it's probably going to come back to bite me. I think Saleh raises the floor, and part of it could just be like hopium for me because they drafted Keldrick Falk. It's really funny that Keldrick, one of my lead comp for Falk over the summer after studying from last year was Reek Armstead, and I'm like, of course he ends up there. But to me, it's going to be the polar opposite of what he was asked to do in that Auburn defense, where it's like all like 3-man, like contain rushes, keep these mobile SEC quarterbacks in the pocket, and now like just pin your ears back and go.
Go, go, go.
Yeah, I'm going to feel one way or the other about my Keldrick Falk evaluation and projection pretty quickly. I don't think I don't have to wait long on that one. But like you add John Franklin Myers and Solomon Thomas and Jordan Elliott, and it's like, yep, these guys all know like how to play in the scheme. They've added a lot of guys to the secondary. You draft Anthony Hill. You guys talked about it all yesterday, but yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic. I don't think they're going to win 11 games this year, but color me intrigued by the Tennessee Titans.
I said this in the moment when we were talking about Keldrick Falk, but I was kind of like, I don't know, man. Right? Like, I mean, and part of it is because of the way he was used, and like you can go whole games without seeing him get more than 3 reps as like a wide wide edge rusher in like a pass first situation. But even in the moments where he was doing that, I was kind of like, I don't know. Like, I just, how do I feel about this? And then I watched the Georgia game and I was like, all right. It's like you look at the frame, you look at the testing, you look at the age. Like I was like, all right, I'd bet on this. And so get him at 31 the way that they did, I think they have to feel pretty good about that. So I have come around on Keldrick Falk just for you.
Now, I remember when I came on the show before the draft last year, we talked about Shamar Stewart, and I was like very out on Shamar Stewart. And I know that there's been a lot of comps, so like from Shamar Stewart to Keldrick Falk, and I could not get that. To me, like they are not the same. So I'm really excited to see what he looks like here in the NFL.
Keldrick Falk is just so much smoother than Shamar Stewart as a player.
Yeah.
Like it just
Yes.
like you watch Keldrick Falk play, and there is like a smoothness to him, and that's just Shamar Stewart's such a rigid player. They're very different to me.
Very much so.
And so I definitely understand the appeal of a Keldrick Falk and the excitement about him. So we'll see about the Titans. I have like a 1-year moratorium on getting excited about the Titans. I'm gonna I'll let somebody else get excited about the 2026 Titans, even if it's warranted.
Yeah. Well, look, I don't have to talk about it every day, so I don't have to live it like you do. But I'll just be here in the corner. I'll just be sitting here watching. I'll be like, cautiously optimistic, and my ears will perk up every time I might have to watch them on TV.
All right. That was fun. That's all we got for today. Very good to have you. I'm sorry we did not have you on during the pre-draft process. I do not know how I did that as somebody who schedules all this shit. So thank you very, very much for taking the time after the draft to do this. I know that hopefully you and Dane and a lot of other people will be getting some sleep here over the next week or so when things quiet down. Please tell everyone, even with the draft being over, where they can check out all the work that you guys are doing over there at All City.
Yep, you can check out the Die Hard Draft Guide. It's available. You can go. I wrote up hundreds of players, bios on hundreds more. So go check that out. The $26 it can get you just the draft stuff, even if you're not a member of one of our markets across the country. I've got the All NFL Draft newsletter, perfectly free. That's free. Get an email from me once a week in your inbox, and it's anything that's percolating in my mind, draft related. It's going to be a lot of like team building stuff and philosophy and things of that, position specific. So I'll be doing a lot of that this summer as I start to watch this 2027 class that everybody's excited about.
Awesome. All right. Well, we will be back tomorrow with our last thought about the 2026 NFL draft, and that's projecting forward a little bit. Now that the draft is over, what are the biggest questions that we still have remaining? One of them is who's going to play on the right side of the offensive line for those Tennessee Titans. So we're going to have a lot of that over the next couple days. Looking forward to that conversation. And then on Friday, I believe we're going to start our buying or selling offseason series that we did last year, breaking the league up into 4 groups, which I loved doing a year ago. Very excited to bring those back again this year. For now, that is all we got. Sincerely appreciate you guys listening. We'll talk to you very soon. Thanks for watching. Follow The Athletic Football Show wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube.